everyone, and to tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. Before we commence the meeting, I request that all mobile telephones are turned off or switched to silent. Thank you. My name is Councillor Stavrou, and I chair this committee. The Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting has been live streamed on the Council website to enable public viewing of the proceedings, including councillor deliberations and voting. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the Council website as soon as practicable after the meeting. Should technical problems be encountered during the meeting will be adjourned and until the problem is rectified. If needed, the meeting will be postponed. I will start by introducing my fellow councillors, and seated to my left at the horseshoe table in the Council chamber are Councillor Jim Park, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, also our Mayor, Councillor Wes Gold, Councillor Di Gillies, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, Councillor Gary Thompson, Councillor Jane Adders, Councillor Susan Bigger, and Councillor Victor Franco. I also acknowledge the Director of Urban Living, Mr. Scott Walker, to my right, and our Coordinator of Governance, Mrs. Kirsten Ritchie, to my left. There are other officers in attendance this evening, and they will be introduced as they present their reports. The primary purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with each report, which includes a summary of the objections received. For those in the gallery presenting this evening, when we come to the agenda item, I will introduce the officer, and I will then call you one by one to come forward and address the committee. If you're making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please do not repeat what earlier speakers have said, and keep the submission focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you're opposed to the planning application, please tell the committee why you disagree and suggest an alternative approach that would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or detail in the officer's report. There is a strict limit of 3 minutes for each speaker, including councillors, and whilst as chair I can vary the time, I will seldom do. I will ask the speakers to sit at the top of the horseshoe table, and I will invite those against the report to speak first, followed by those that are in favour. At the 2.5 minute mark, I will make this sound, indicating that you have 30 seconds remaining to conclude your presentation. Move to apologies. Mrs. Ritchie, are there any apologies this evening?
Through you, Chair, there are no apologies for tonight's meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Ritchie. We have the next item on the agenda, adoption and confirmation of the minutes. Councillors, can I please have a motion to adopt and confirm the minutes of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting held on the 3rd of April 2023? Councillor Gillies?
So moved, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. A seconder, Councillor Sinfield. Thank you.
Second.
Councillors, is there anybody opposed? There be no opposition. I put the motion to the vote. The vote is carried unanimously. Thank you. The second item on the agenda, declaration of conflict of interest. Councillors and council officers, are there any conflicts of interest that need to be declared? There be no conflict of interest. We'll move to the main part of our agenda. Item 3. And we have the first item on the agenda is 3.1. This item will be introduced by Ms. Carter, and it's Amendment C388 Borough, Smithsdale Estate, Precinct Heritage Overlay, Exhibition Outcomes. Ms. Carter, please proceed.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. This report is to inform the committee of the outcomes of the exhibition of Amendment C388 BORO and the officer response to the submissions. Amendment C388 proposes to apply the heritage overlay to the Smithsdale Estate Precinct, including 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 and 18 Carlisle Street, Hawthorn East, and 81, 83, 85, 85A, 87 and 89 Harcourt Street, Hawthorn East. Exhibition of the amendment was from the 9th of February to the 3rd of April 2023. A total of 24 submissions have been received. Of these, 21 are in support of the proposed heritage overlay, 2 are opposed, and 1 is partially supporting. The key concerns raised in the opposing submissions include social and economic issues, including cost of living pressures, housing shortages and demographic changes, personal impacts, including on property value and the time and cost of the planning process, that there is no merit to the heritage proposal, and disagreement with the inclusion of a non-contributory property. Officers have reviewed all submissions received and have provided a response at attachment 1 of tonight's report. No changes to the heritage citation are recommended in response to the submissions. Officers now seek a resolution from the committee to request the appointment of an independent planning panel by the Minister for Planning and to refer all submissions to the panel for consideration. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms Carter. We will move to people that wish to present tonight. We've only got one presenter for this item tonight, and they are for the recommendation. So can I call Ms Jane Oldham to come to the horseshoe table, please? Let me remind that we do have 3 minutes. Please commence your submission with your name and suburb. Thank you.
Good evening, councillors and officers. If I could just say, my name's Jane Oldham from Camberwell, and I am speaking on behalf of Christina Brannigan, who's unable to be here tonight. So I shall read her speech. I fully support the officers' recommendations tonight. The houses that would make up the proposed Smarsdale Heritage Precinct represent an important section of the Victorian and Edwardian streetscape in this part of Harcourt Street and nearby. Their inclusion will augment the value of the 3 neighbouring heritage precincts. I thank Council for undertaking the extra work to include these houses that were not picked up in the municipal-wide gap study of the area. I also thank them for accepting the community nomination by a number of local residents, including myself. We could see by recent change in the area that if left unprotected, this area was definitely going to gradually lose its heritage houses. Number 89 in particular is a wonderful, magnificent example of an Italianate house that is a landmark on the corner of Burke Road and Harcourt Street. It was recognised by the National Trust and in the Hawthorn Conservation Study of the 1980s as a significant heritage place, yet had never been protected. It's also a place that holds and tells the story for us of some important pieces of Hawthorn history. Jessie Henderson, who lived there from 1900 for over 50 years, received a CBE for her work to improve the lives and healthcare of women and is recognised via entries in the number of public archives that record people of significance. She has an entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography and was appointed a CBE in 1936. Her importance and impact is also evidenced by her induction into the Victorian Honour Roll for Women. She was a social welfare worker and a community worker, and a great advocate for women's issues in the fields of health and other social and financial areas. She worked to deliver improved health services for women in areas of birth control and maternity care. She was also a leading member of the National Council of Women, an influential early 20th century body advocating for and achieving greater influence for Australian women. She was involved with numerous charities. Her 2 young soldier sons were killed in Gallipoli under the command of the hugely famous political icon General Pompey Elliott, who was also a resident in Prospect Hill Road, Camberwell. Although Jessie's work was not considered by the state's heritage regulations as significant enough to meet Criterion H, it is great to see that she will be acknowledged in a statement of significance for her magnificent heritage home, and that the City of Boroondara has taken this opportunity to record the achievements in one of our heritage citations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions for Ms Oldham? Thank you very much. You may return to your seat.
Thanks.
We're move next to a response from the officers?
I think we don't have anything further to add other than to thank the submitters for their time.
Thank you very much for that. Councillors, are there any questions for the officers? Councillor Sinfield.
No question, but ready with a motion when you are.
I think I'm ready.
The officer's recommendation, please, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. It's seconded, I see, by Councillor Hollingsworth. Are there, councillors, is there anyone opposed to this recommendation to assist the mover? There been no opposition. As the mover, Councillor Sinfield, would you like to speak to your motion?
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly, and I'd particularly like to thank the community for bringing this, the property at 89 Harcourt Street and the surrounding properties to our attention. If it hadn't been for the community picking up the phone and letting us know, then I would have probably continued to drive up and down Burke Road every day and assume that the property at 89 Harcourt Street was in fact protected. So I thank them for bringing it to our attention and for the information that they've provided in support of this. Addressing this, this precinct of 12 properties assists to close the gap a little bit in that area on the map where we don't have any properties protected. The other end of Harcourt Street is where the Beswick properties sit, but this end there is quite a gap and they're certainly worth protecting. So I thank the officers for the work they've done on this and commend this motion to my colleagues.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Hollingsworth, do you have anything to add to that?
Thank you. I just echo the Mayor's comments, and I'm very grateful this is before us tonight in the chamber. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. I don't think you have anything else you wish to say, Councillor Sinfield. Let me put the motion then to the councillors. Those in favour? The motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Moving on to item 3.2. We have 9 Seattle Street, Baldwin North, outcome of exhibition, amendment C381 Borough. This item will be presented by Ms. Bryan. Ms. Bryan, please proceed.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Good evening, councillors, officers and attendees. The purpose of this report is to inform the Urban Planning Delegated Committee on the outcomes of the public exhibition of Amendment C381 BORO. The amendment proposes to include 9 Seattle Street, Baldwin North in the Heritage Overlay as an individually significant property. The report also seeks a resolution to request the Minister for Planning to appoint a planning panel and to refer all submissions to an independent planning panel for consideration. The property at 9 Seattle Street, Baldwin North was identified for a detailed heritage assessment as part of the Baldwin Stage 3 peer review. Following lodgement of a planning permit application that implied complete demolition of the house, a priority heritage assessment was carried out in May-June 2022. On 18th of July 2022, the UPDC resolved to adopt the heritage citation, proceed to a planning scheme amendment for a permanent heritage overlay without preliminary consultation, and request introduction of an interim heritage overlay. Council wrote to the Minister for Planning to request authorisation to prepare an amendment to the Boroondara planning scheme to include 9 Seattle Street, Baldwin North in the heritage overlay. Authorisation was granted to prepare and exhibit Amendment C381 BORO on 31st of October 2022. The interim heritage overlay for the site was gazetted on 30th of September 2022. Amendment C381 BORO was on public exhibition from 9th of February to 9th of March 2023. A total of 3 opposing submissions were received. 3 objecting submissions were received, which are outlined along with officer responses in attachment 1 of the report. No changes are recommended to the citation or statement of significance. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bryan. We have no speakers for this item tonight, so councillors, are there any questions for Ms. Bryan? There being no questions, do I have a mover? Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair. I move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Sinfield.
Happy to second.
Is there any opposition? There be no opposition. Councillor Park as the mover, do you wish to speak to the motion?
No, the report's fairly comprehensive, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I take it, Councillor Sinfield, you don't wish to speak either. Well then, let me put the motion. Those in favour? The motion's carried unanimously. Thank you for that. Thank you, Ms. Bryan. And the next item on the agenda is item 3.3, Community Heritage Nomination Process, consideration of revised process. This item will be presented by Mr. Christian Wilson. Mr. Wilson, please proceed.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Good evening, councillors and attendees. This report presents a revised community heritage nomination process following further consideration of feedback received by the community in discussions with Council's Heritage Advisory Committee. Following previous UPDC meetings in May 2022 and September 2022, officers have prepared the revised nomination process. The revised process aims to respond to the key concerns expressed by councillors and community members at those meetings and includes the following key changes. Instead of 4 eligibility criteria for the consideration of a nomination for heritage assessment, only 1 criterion now exists, and that criterion is whether new information about the place's potential significance is available. The new information is not limited to any specific heritage criteria, but can be for any of the 8 heritage HERCON criteria. Nominations will also be progressed as soon as possible, rather than, as previously proposed, as 1 annual amendment. That provides greater clarity and transparency for affected property owners to progress the matter in a timely way. The revised process is set out in the attachment 1, and there are detailed explanatory notes at attachment 2 of the report. The revised process has significant resource implications due to the more open entry point and the need to process nominations individually. As a result, the proposed process can only be implemented with additional staff resourcing and budget allocation as detailed in the body of the report. If adopted and subject to budget being allocated for the 23-24 financial year, the strategic planning team will implement the nomination process, and it also requires the setting up a panel of heritage experts to actually undertake the assessments of any places for which a nomination has been accepted. Following a 12-month period after process inception, an initial review of the process will be carried out to evaluate its efficacy, effectiveness. 2 years after commencement, a comprehensive review will be completed and any necessary changes will be brought back to the committee for confirmation or changes to the process. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We have 3 people that wish to speak to and indicated to make a submission to this matter. There are 2 against the recommendation and 1 in support. Once I have announced your name, please sit at the top of the horseshoe table. If a submitter is not present, we will call the next one. First submitter is Mr. Greg Price, followed by Mrs. Jane Oldham, who will be speaking on her behalf this time. Thank you, Mr. Price. Please proceed to the horseshoe table. Could you please state your name and suburb?
Thanks, Chair. Good evening, councillors. I'm Greg Price from Glen Iris. Regarding the nomination process, I've been following this one carefully. I request that the heritage interest layer be made public, either through a DELP or layer, or whatever the department's called now, or through the interactive map that council has. Essentially, it's the only definitive way to ask council whether a development would be opposed or not, because until that point, there's essentially it's acting as a secret planning control, and the only way to get a definitive answer, to get approval on whether you can demolish and hence redevelop, say, as I did, is to submit a 29A and to do that. And the problem is that typically by the time you submit a 29A application, you've gone through a great expense and all sorts of, creating plans, as opposed to asking the fundamental question, am I allowed to redevelop this property? So I believe that database layer should be made public, and this has been a long-standing point. Back to the proposed proposal. How will submitters know if it's new information is being submitted? Because a lot of the time, the previous information wasn't made public. So when, why certain streets were selected or individual properties. And so the proposal talks about providing new information, or isn't that relevant to what submitters should have on hand? I also find that there's been some regular references to comparing Boroondara to Yarra and Port Phillip, local government areas recently, regarding the number of heritage-listed properties. And I'm curious, is there some sort of target level that we're looking to achieve for heritage coverage, or is there some sort of competition? Because I'm not sure how it's actually relevant to the processes and what goes on in Boroondara. And I guess I'm a little bit alarmed at the costs overall, it's like how this fits in, and if, is the process that's being proposed, is it predicated on the budgetary outcomes in the future? So essentially, will the decision here tonight be predicated on future budget negotiations later on? And they are all my questions, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Well within time. Are there any questions for Mr. Price? There be no questions. You may return to the gallery. Thank you very much. No problem at all. Our next is Miss Jane Oldham.
Good evening again, and I'm still from Camberwell. Community nomination. The process being considered reflects a recent one, of nominations that have involved community members, councillors and officers. It's not always been the easiest. I would like to recognise and thank councillors who have supported the evolution of the revised process, and particularly the work done in the last 12 months. Equally, I would like to thank officers for their work and acknowledge the extent to which their thinking has evolved over the past year. The revised process is a significant improvement which recognises that the community has a role in identifying heritage places worthy of protection. Importantly, it explicitly seeks a balance with the interests of owners, and I am supportive of the resolutions tonight. I'd like to make 4 points covering funding, privacy, security of nominators, and the communication transparency with external stakeholders. Firstly, funding. The process is dependent on funding, and I would encourage all councillors to support it. Some of you may be of the view that enough time, resource and money has been spent on heritage. However, the gap studies were necessarily constrained, so gaps remain, places were missed and new information emerges. To leave such places unprotected and condemn what they represent to landfill would be a legacy harshly judged in decades to come. Today's community has already demonstrated its support. Security of nominators. Nominators must feel secure that they are protected from inappropriate conduct or communications from owners or others. There is more at stake here than with most planning applications. Applying privacy laws with care and discretion to any request for disclosure is vital. Will nominators be notified promptly when and with which details and to whom disclosure is made? Excluding physical addresses is desirable. New information. Acceptance of a nomination depends upon it including new information, something that cannot be defined and won't always be clear-cut. Success of the process will involve the development of community trust. Any rejection needs to include a robust explanation, and also the same for any nomination that is accepted. Postal nomination should be accepted. Next, moving to places that are in a study that hasn't been adopted. Is a place identified in such a study to be accepted? And if not, how will it be considered? I understand the Boyd House at Tannock Street, Balwyn, would fall within this example. Communication. Over the next 2 years, it will be a learning process for all. I would encourage communication about any concerns to be prompt so that they can be addressed. It's in our interest.
Mrs. Altham, your time has expired. Are you almost finished?
Yes, I am. It's in everybody's interest, councillors, officers and the community, for this process to succeed.
Thank you very much. I don't see anybody wanting to ask a question, so thank you for your presentation. You may return to the gallery. We have one more speaker, Ms. Robin Kelly. Could you please proceed to the horseshoe table, Ms. Kelly? Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Could you please proceed with your name and suburb? Thank you. And you have 3 minutes.
My name is Robin Kelly of 2A Careep Road, Balwyn.
Thank you.
I am in all the Burundara Historical Societies, the Royal Historical Society, an honorary member of the National Trust. I put my complete faith in all you councillors to do the right thing by our heritage. I look at where I had my house for 40 years in McGregor Street, Canterbury, and I look at what Laurie Butner did to get heritage there on 2,000 shops and dwellings. And at first it was thought they will diminish in value, but no, it has been a fantastic move. I was on the committee there, and I encourage you to respect and love our heritage and to do all you can. And thank you for improving the heritage details that you have improved so much. Is my photograph up on the board, please? Thank you very much. I draw your attention to an 1856 Warrandyte stone farmhouse at the Doncaster tram terminus at 192 Doncaster Road, Balwyn North. It is for sale again. I have had to stand up at auctions 4 times in the last 18 months to defend its heritage. The agents try to sell it, not saying it's heritage. Please go and look at it. It's 20 years, built 20 years after John Batman came. And I think right at the corner of Balwyn Road and Doncaster Road, 2 houses in, west, we should be buying it for the people. Manningham have Schramm's Cottage, Whitehorse has Schwerkold's Cottage. We could have this wonderful cottage for the people, for the school children. We could buy the house on the corner, have there for the parking, for the buses, for the coffee buses, and it is built from Warrandyte stone. It would be fantastic position. It used to be on the whole hilltop by Mr. Roberts, built by Mr. Roberts, an outstation in good condition, walls 1.5 feet thick, window sills 1.5, 18 inches thick, and a small backyard, so you've got a big frontage right there at the terminus. The front gate, you're looking at the tram terminus. Mary Drost and I looked over the fence 6 years ago. It's got a high fence in front of it, but go and look at it. The previews are on until they have the auction that they haven't stated the date of yet, which I will have to stand up again at and have things thrown at me, be photographed. So please, let's get this for the people. Thank you. About 1.7 to 1.8.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. You finished well within time. There are no questions, I believe. You may return to the gallery to your seat. Thank you. Now let me return to the officers for any matters arising.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. Just a few points to pick up. Greg Price's comment around nominated places to be made public, and that's spelled out in the report and the process as well. The intention is that places where nomination is accepted and that they're intended for a detailed heritage assessment, they'll be visible through Council's website, either the intention is to have that done through the interactive heritage map that currently already exists on the website. But if might be some technical challenges with that, so I don't want to commit entirely, but those properties will be visible on the website. The issue of a target level for heritage protection, a simple answer, there is no target for heritage protection. And the question is whether it is worthy of protection or not, and whatever is worthy of protection should be protected. The overall cost of the process is set out in the budget, in the officer report. And as I said in the introduction, and is also spelled out in the report, that without that budget allocation, the process can't be resourced and can't be implemented. With regards to the comments by Ms. Oldham, funding comments I've just spoke about. With regards to the privacy and the security of the nominators and the call for that to be done in accordance with legislation, there'll be a privacy statement that forms part of the nomination form. The intention is to adhere to any requirements that exist with regards to the release of personal information, but there may be instances where personal information has to be released under relevant legislation and guidelines, and in those instances we cannot guarantee that that information might not be provided to a third party. So we can't say with certainty or 100% agree that that information will never be released publicly or provided to other parties. And then there was a comment around new information, and the explanatory reports provide some guidance around how that will be considered. Obviously, for individuals that might want to nominate a place, they don't have the information as to what the heritage consultant might have considered at the time. That's just a gamble that will, I suppose, in some ways have to be taken at the time of lodging the nomination with the documentary evidence. If that has already been considered and hasn't led to a place recommended, then obviously that nomination won't be accepted. But sorry, it sounded like I'd gone off. But unfortunately, it's probably not possible to provide 100% certainty to individuals that make a nomination as to what information has previously been considered, and that's what this process is about, to work out whether the information has previously been considered or not. And if it hasn't, then we will undertake the heritage assessment and consider that information. And I think that covers it, but I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wilsman. I have Councillor Thompson, followed by Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Wilmson, I just wanted to, I'm not sure if I correctly heard it, so I might ask the question again on behalf of Mr. Price. So if you're a prospective purchaser or an owner of a property, can you search to see if your property is on the possible heritage layer?
At the moment, you can't, but with this process, you will be able to.
Okay, so we're not hiding anything from our community as to, so that they can make their own commercial decisions after they've done their own due diligence.
That's correct. So transparency is one of the key points of this process, because that's one thing that obviously has been lacking in the absence of a process and the way that they have been processed, those nominations so far. So that's really a key fundamental principle of the process.
Thank you, Mr. Wilmson. No further questions.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wilmson, just following on from Councillor Thompson's question, would it be feasible to encourage real estate agents to also develop as a due course to look at Burundara's website in the event that any properties were listed for heritage? And when I'm saying that, I'm not saying that we have an obligation to enforce them to do so, but is it something that we could provide some advocacy for?
Certainly there's an opportunity when the process commences and nominations are open, that there'll be some communication, a communication campaign or a promotion campaign, so to speak, to make that information available. That process is open. real estate agents have a due diligence and they make inquiries to council on a regular basis around properties and what might or might not happen to those. And when that information is publicly available, if a phone call gets made, that information will be able to be provided to them.
Thank you very much. My other questions were just in relation to just seeking clarification with Appendix A or Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. So Appendix 1 to your report, is that the actual community heritage nomination process, the one-page map?
So that's a process diagram that provides an overview of what the process will look like at a high level.
Yes.
It doesn't cover every administrative step that's being taken by officers as part of that, but that's how the process is meant to function.
Thank you. It was just looking at the report, I was just a little bit confused with what is Appendix 1 and what is Appendix 2. Are you able to clarify?
So Appendix 1 is the flow chart only that shows that's actually an extracted page from Attachment 2, which is the draft explanatory notes.
Yes.
The endorsement is of the process. The draft explanatory notes are not there for endorsement or adoption by the committee. It's just the process being adopted as it is represented in the diagram.
Thank you. That was my understanding. I just wanted to seek clarification just with the page numbering in the report. It was a little bit confusing. And if I may ask one more question, with the document in its draft form, it refers to quite a lot of what would be hyperlinks to other pieces of information. All of those underlined hyperlinks, I presume if this is supported tonight, they would actually be hyperlinks so you could go to that information? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay. And I would like to foreshadow a motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. I have Councillor Watson, followed by Councillor Franco next. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. My questions centre around an issue raised by Mr Price in his presentation concerning 29A. So he talked about someone making plans for the development of their property and how much time and investment gets made prior to Section 29A being applied for. So we just had an example tonight at 9 Seattle Street in Baldwin North where somebody applied for a 29A and what that triggered was a planning review because that property had been previously identified, and I certainly understand that. But my question is, with this particular process, if somebody does their work and then applies for a 29A, and you've got this on some list or something of properties that have been identified, and I have another question about process in a minute here. How long is your process going to take of review once somebody has sort of tripped the wire on applying for a 29A? How much extra time does this add to an owner to get through this new process that you're planning, you have proposed this evening?
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure that I 100% understand the question, but in response to Section 29A, Council has 15 days to respond to those.
Yep.
So within that period of time, we have to make a determination as to whether we seek an interim heritage overlay for the site or not. So that's 15 days from the day that that application is lodged. How long the entire process takes from a nomination to be made by a community member for us to run through all of that for a final decision to be made as to whether the site is included in the heritage overlay on a permanent basis or not, that's probably how long is a piece of string, because there could be, usually we say for people running through a planning scheme amendment process, 12 to 18 months. Where we have some time saving with this process is that where there is a place that's under threat of demolition, we're proposing to not go through the preliminary consultation process, which obviously slices off a considerable number of months, because we can go straight to the amendment process for the permanent heritage overlay, and to basically remove that step. That also increases the chances for success for the interim heritage overlay. So I'm not quite sure whether that...
It does. So you're basically saying that if a property, if you decide to put an interim heritage overlay, it's going to add at least a year for a property owner to get an outcome, whether it's yes or no.
So, sort of. If an interim heritage overlay is applied to the property and the minister supports that request from council, then a planning permit trigger exists, and the property owner can apply to council to demolish that building, and they could then seek that, to prosecute that through VCAT with an appeal if council were to refuse that. It's a parallel process different to the planning permit process. So a decision could be reached by that if they found a favourable VCAT member to support the demolition. But ultimately the process, you would probably say 12 to 18 months.
Thank you. And my next question relates to criteria. You say that it's 4 criteria down to 1, which is just further information. So without straying into the ridiculous, if somebody is wanting to have a property investigated, they basically can come up with anything. It could be that a Prime Minister slept overnight in a property and they think that's meaningful. So, it triggers a process that you have to go through. It appears to me quite open-ended, but are there any barriers? You say that it's any further information. Do we have any barriers around this? Because I've got a note here about 8 heritage criteria, which seems to be slightly at odds with anything goes, is how I heard it.
No, thank you for the question. I didn't say anything goes. I said that the new information can relate to any of the 8 HERCON criteria that relate to historical significance, rarity, architectural significance, representative significance, and so forth. The example that you brought, the Prime Minister slept there for one night. In the draft explanatory notes, there are some guidelines around what we might consider, and we will look at the information, and where we think that that information is unlikely to actually have any significant impact on changing or resulting in a property being of heritage significance or recommended for protection, then that information will be rejected. So that's probably an extreme example, and there will be grey areas, but that's where we will rely on the advice from the heritage consultant, and where officers might not be sure as to whether that's actually information that's worthwhile, if you want to put it that way, that the advice from the heritage consultant is thought, and they'll then be able to say, that's not really going to change or is not really going to have an impact or result in any recommendation based on their professional experience, without undertaking a detailed assessment. So trying to cut those types of nominations off as early as possible in the process, that we don't go through the effort of having a detailed assessment done.
Yeah, and further question, you want to cut them off early, but you can't cut them off altogether. So meaning you will still have to assess and use officers' time and money and ratepayers' money and resources to knock out something, whether it's significant or trivial. It's still going to involve time.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. That concludes my question.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Franco. And then I have Councillor Thompson again.
Thank you, Chair, through you. Is it fair to describe the process as effectively taking the ad hoc process that we've got now and formalising it? But it's effectively the process we've got now, but encapsulated, if you like, in a formal policy.
Yes, more or less.
Good. That's how I read it, and I don't have a problem with that. My next question is, does it introduce any efficiencies? I mean, it streamlines a little bit potentially in terms of knocking some out earlier and in a quicker way than the current process?
Yes, it provides us with something to say whether a nomination is accepted or not. At the moment, we've got really nothing.
So, Mr. Walker wants to add a point to this.
If I could just add a point to that as well, through yourself, Chair, it brings consistency. So it brings some certainty to officers in knowing how to approach a community heritage nomination when it's brought forward, and that brings an efficiency in it through that consistency.
Yes, that certainly makes sense. My next concern then, and this is why then do we need 2 additional heritage planners, admittedly over and above 0, so I can see the benefit in that, but the budget allocation of 800,000, given that it's effective, and it does provide certainty and clarity, but it's the process we're doing now. So we don't, and so perhaps you can answer that one.
Thank you. The reason for that is that the resourcing implications that we're already experiencing and have experienced mean that other parts of the work program can't be delivered. And that's really something that we've seen for the last 6 years since the commencement of the Heritage Gap Study, that probably 95% of officer time is taken up with dealing with heritage nominations, particularly in the last couple of years since was to be expected with the municipal-wide Heritage Gap Study, but there were significant economies of scale factors at play with the gap study that individual officers could deal with this. Now, with the repeated and individual nominations that are being processed, the resourcing demands and the ability to, and the impact that it has on the overall work program has resulted in a lot of projects not being able to be delivered and significantly delayed because this is demanding too much attention, and therefore the need for the 2 additional resources to resource that process so that the unit can deliver the other work program as well that it has to do.
Councillor Franco, are you comfortable with that answer?
I'd like a little bit more. Perhaps we have, in terms of the proposed officer resolution or recommendation for a motion, and I don't know if that's what will be moved, but it says, it adds at point 1, subject to the allocation, to a budget allocation for the 2023-24 financial year. Is that to be read, if that motion goes ahead, that this doesn't come into effect until after the budget is adopted?
Through yourself, Chair, that's correct. This process will only come into place if the budget is adopted. It's reliant on that budget. If I can just summarise as well the answer provided in regard to the question about aren't we already doing this process and aren't we already funding it effectively, which is essentially what the question that has been asked is. There are 2 key aspects. Firstly, the existing work program is already compromised by the ad hoc process that's occurring now. So we already have a compromised work program because of the prioritisation of these ad hoc nominations coming through. The second aspect is that there will be more community heritage nominations, given that the strategic work has now come to a close with the Heritage Gap work, and that there is now further scrutiny of heritage potential in properties that may have been missed or want to be revisited by the community from that gap work. So there's an increasing number of nominations coming forward. So they're the 2 key impacts on work and the work program for officers.
So the final one is this is perhaps not the forum to discuss the budget allocation and the budgetary needs, but it might be helpful, and I take it that's there and a separate discussion will occur, but it would be helpful for councillors and for me to understand a sort of drill down within the operational budget of the planning department into terms of how much has been spent, say, on current heritage processes in terms of staff allocation time and external consultant reports and the like, so we can have a clearer understanding. And if that would be possible to be provided, that's my question, in the appropriate forum at the appropriate time to enable us to make a budgetary decision in relation to this matter.
Sure. As it's not for tonight, Mr. Walker, I'm assuming it can be provided?
No problem at all.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. You're good. Thanks, Councillor Franco. Next, we have Councillor Thompson, followed by Councillor Sinfield. Apologies, Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Thompson got ahead, but it is his second time, so I do apologise.
Mine's a very simple one, with your indulgence. Would officers mind flipping the very front image so that it's actually the correct way for the Camberwell Town Hall? It might irk me if it stays as it is, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Sinfield, not flipping it back, please.
Thank you, Chair. No, I'm not going to flip it back again. I'm seeking officer advice, please, on point 1 of the officer's recommended motion that is on the screen. It is my understanding that attachment 1 only is being endorsed tonight, but the first paragraph there says, described in this report at attachments 1 and 2. Is that erroneous, and therefore officers might review their proposed recommended motion prior to it being moved by Councillor Hollingsworth?
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. It's probably clearer if we remove an attachment 2, but it was meant as an explanation, adopt the process as it is described in there, but I can see the potential confusion around the adoption of that document. So maybe the deletion of "and" 2 would provide greater clarity.
Thank you. I think for clarity that would be beneficial so that attachment 2 can remain the living document that it is proposed to be that will evolve over the next 24 months.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Addis, another.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'm still struggling a bit with the explanation that was given to, well, essentially following Mr. Price's query and Councillor Watson. And what I'm seeking to understand is how this will protect people who in good faith spend a lot of money and put a lot of work into preparing plans, and at that point they realise it's feasible and apply to demolish. And then in the next few days, the community somehow hears about that and puts in a nomination, and I'm concerned that it goes against fairness, essentially, that if somebody's done a lot of work in good faith.
Mr. Walker, please.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. What has been put forward in this community heritage nomination process is bringing forward the point that we as a council are transparent about a nomination having been received. And what that will do is ensure that there's not a situation where we're aware of a nomination and are undertaking work and have received or underway with advice that might suggest a property has heritage, whilst concurrently a landowner has no idea about that nomination and about that work that's being done and is preparing significant plans for demolition or some development, and then is confronted by a situation when they do lodge a 29A application for demolition and only find out about it then when we stop that process. So this will overcome that situation and help in terms of transparency for a landowner. What it won't do is change what happens prior to a nomination being submitted or received. If we don't know about a nomination, we do not have that work being undertaken or information that might suggest a property has heritage, that's an unknown, and we won't know about that. A landowner won't know about that. A landowner may well, up to that point of a nomination being submitted, may well have prepared plans and done extensive information. And it is correct that maybe a planning permit application is submitted based on that work that's undertaken by a landowner that prompts a community heritage nomination to come in, that will then trigger a process under this new process that has been set up, and that is a possibility.
So there's nothing here that would allow officers to say, no, I'm sorry, there's a process already in train, we can't accept that nomination. A process seeking demolition.
Through yourself, Chair, no, there's not. If there was a process underway, there is nothing that would stop a nomination being submitted in this process.
Okay, thank you. So, perhaps a bit unrelated, will this process allow greater clarity in situations to allow officers to say no as well as yes if a nomination comes in? Because I guess what I'm seeking is some sort of clarity that this is a better process, that it allows a no just as easily as it allows a yes. Is that, sorry, am I not clear?
Yeah.
Through yourself, Chair, perhaps a couple of things first, and perhaps you may restate a question again to get further clarification. This will provide greater transparency for everyone. And what it will do as well is also fast-track a situation where a more detailed heritage assessment is undertaken when a 29A application is put forward by a landowner. So it will mean that if the property does not have heritage, we will get to that answer quicker, because a landowner may well be aware that the nominations come in and actually trigger that process to happen quickly through submitting a 29A. So it may, in many situations, actually assist a landowner get to an outcome and get to the next step that they want to get to and get it put behind them in a faster way. So that may be of assistance.
I think
there would also be the possibility, and this may be that is part of the review process that happens at the 12-month and 2-year mark. There is a possibility of reviewing the process or even setting the process up now where nominations are not able to be accepted, and it's up to the committee to make this decision. Nominations are not able to be accepted if a 29A application had already been put forward, for example. So that's always a possibility to adjust this if it's considered more appropriate from a fairness point of view for landowners.
I wasn't seeking to relate it to 29As in this instance. I just wanted to be sure that this would allow a clearer opportunity to say no as well as yes with any nomination.
And that's accepting the nomination, absolutely, because we will have the resourcing to be able to make that judgment quickly. If a nomination is put forward and it's not genuine new information, we'll be able to make that assessment quickly and say, no, it's not accepted as a nomination.
Thank you. And this is sort of a follow-up. Are you confident that it's clear enough what would be considered frivolous, a bit like Councillor Watson said, and we would say, no, sorry, that's not adequate. can we be confident that officers have a clear view about what is legitimate and what's time-wasting frivolous?
Please, Mr. Walker.
Again, through yourself, Chair, officers have considered this quite carefully and explored how we can provide some absolute clarity of what's needed to be new information. And we've tested out some different scenarios to try and work through how we would filter those out. Officers are confident that we're able to get to that point pretty quickly, and we've tested that through many scenarios. An example may well be, and this is quite a common situation, where residents may write to council on a street that may well have been tested for heritage previously and heritage hasn't been accepted for the street, and write to council and say things like, it's a lovely street, there are beautiful dwellings in the street, how can this possibly not have heritage? And that wouldn't be an unusual thing to happen where someone says, well, can you go back and look at it again? That wouldn't be considered new information. There's nothing new in what's being put forward in that sort of scenario. It actually has to be genuine information which may well lead to a different conclusion about whether heritage is warranted for that location, for that building, that dwelling, that street or that area.
Sorry, just one final one. Is there any sense that people can't just keep having another bite at it? Oh, well, look, I'll put forward this because you've rejected what I've already put forward.
Again, through yourself, Chair, there can be multiple nominations for a property, and that is a risk in this process that we will receive multiple requests from different angles to try and meet that threshold of new information, and that's something that we will need to carefully look at whether this process is being abused by submitters, and that's something that we'll need to test out after the 12-month and 2-year review point.
Councillor Addis, you're comfortable with that?
Not entirely, but I'm comfortable that I've got a response. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got Councillor Franco again, or not?
I thought it was Councillor Watson.
Councillor Park?
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Following on from a question that was asked by Councillor Franco, I just wanted to ask a historic question about heritage studies. How often are they undertaken in the municipality? What's the time interval?
Thank you, Chair. Through you. There's no specific time interval as to how they're progressed or taken. It's in the past, it's generally been a decision by council to commence a study, that being the gap study and previous other studies as well. So there's no specific interval that they're being prepared.
I see. So just to follow on from that, so you said there was a heritage study, then a heritage gap study. Could you answer what was the time interval between those two?
The gap study commenced in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I don't exactly know when the one previously was, but there were a number of them. The Surrey Hills Heritage Study, there was in multiple parts. There were a couple of amendments relating to individual properties throughout the municipality, not at any particular given location. The Baldwin North Deep Dean study was prepared in 2014-15, I think, and then it becomes before my time, but they certainly were undertaken at great frequency throughout the early 2000s.
Okay, and I think the question was already asked, how much roughly does a heritage study cost? I don't think that was available, was it? But millions would probably be the correct answer. So my question is, with this new process that you proposed tonight, it seems to me that heritage would now be essentially an ad hoc nomination. Is this new process going to replace those heritage studies? Are we now moving into a position where heritage is now rolling on every single day, but largely it will rely on the community to nominate, or perhaps we're going to go looking for these things? I don't know. Does this run in conjunction with these big studies that are done, or does this essentially replace those?
Thank you, through you, Chair. No, it doesn't replace those. If the committee or council wanted to undertake a heritage study, be that either a geographically limited heritage study or a thematic heritage study, say post-war buildings, then that's certainly possible for the committee to make that decision and allocate budget for that. Usually they're specifically funded because the cost involved is too great to be carried by the operating budget. This doesn't replace that. It runs in parallel. It provides an opportunity for the community to have a say and put places forward that they felt where new information is available. And we've had examples where there is new information that wasn't available and the consultants were not aware of in their previous assessments, or they missed a property. But it doesn't replace council undertaking specific heritage studies.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Franco.
Thanks. I'd like to ask a couple of questions through you, Chair, in relation to the topic previously raised by Councillor Watson and Mr Price in his presentation. The 29A issue. Just to be abundantly clear, it is the case, is it not, that most applications or nominations are pursuant to a 29 application? Community nominations, pardon my language.
Is the question clear?
Not that. Are you asking whether most community nominations are the result of a Section 29A application?
Pursuant to?
Yeah.
Or a reasonable number, a reasonable percentage?
Well, they're often related, but not specifically, because the Section 29A application is not public information. There's no register that shows that. Often these nominations are triggered because a property is up for sale. That's certainly been the case in the past, and there's concern from members in the community within the area or elsewhere that the property might be subject to a demolition in the future. But generally, Section 29A applications are not something that's public information. Only if someone has insider information from the new owner and having spoken to them or getting that information, I wouldn't have thought that it's directly in response to those.
Okay, so what then would be in your opinion, the key triggers? A sale of a property being one, perhaps planning permit application?
Yep, sorry. Sale of a property, planning permit applications is another one, because they're public information through the planning register that's published, and signs going up on site around applications being on public notice. But also some of the other examples that we've seen are just residents being under the impression that a property is heritage protected and then finding out that it's not, and that's triggering some of those requests as well.
And in just for my clarity, the timing of a 29A application versus, say, a subdivision permit application, what is the relational timing of those?
Okay, thank you, through the Chair. So there's a couple of complexities associated with that. So with the Section 29 application, we have 15 days to respond to that. Or the building department has 15 days to respond to that. Within those 15 days, council has to make a determination as to whether to approve or consent to the Section 29A, suspend the Section 29A, or refuse the Section 29A. Council can only refuse the Section 29A if the site is in a heritage overlay and the required permit has not been obtained. Then council must refuse that. We can suspend consideration of the Section 29A if we have lodged, or if council has lodged a request for interim heritage overlay from the Minister for Planning. So we have 15 days from the time that a Section 29 application is lodged to undertake a heritage assessment to determine whether the site is worthy of heritage protection, and then lodge a Section 20 Part 4 amendment under the Planning and Environment Act for that interim control, which then allows us to suspend that application, and that application remains suspended until a final decision has been made by the Minister on the interim HO request. With a planning permit application, there is no time frame associated with that. The heritage matters that might arise from an assessment that we would still get undertaken at that time cannot be taken into consideration as part of the planning permit assessment process until this property is in a heritage overlay. So it has no bearing on the decision-making process for the planning permit until a heritage overlay is introduced to the site, either an interim or a permanent one. If the application is determined in the meantime, it has to be on grounds other than heritage. So that's a different scenario.
Another question? I'll be
one.
quick.
Yep.
Is there anything preclude? I'm presuming the answer is no, but is there anything precluding a property owner or their agent from lodging a 29A application prior to seeking a planning permit, or is it conventionally? But it's conventionally done. The planning permit is sought first, but not necessarily.
Thank you. And through you, Chair. The only reason under the Burundara planning scheme that a planning permit is required for demolition is if the site is in a heritage overlay. There's no other planning permit trigger for demolition in the Burundara planning scheme.
And is there a way of introducing that?
Through an interim heritage overlay request.
No, I mean changing the planning scheme so that...
No.
Okay.
Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair. The flowchart on page 55, the first up in the top left, add property to list of possible heritage places. Is that the first point where this becomes searchable, say, for a prospective purchaser?
Yes.
Right. Okay, so bearing that point in mind, we come to page 56, which talks about lodgement and document verification. The notion of verifying documents is countenanced, but verification of identity is not something that we're seeking or have considered. That is in terms of the nominator.
As to whether that's actually a real person? No, that's not something we have anticipated.
Right. Because whilst Councillor Addis and others mentioned the possibility of frivolous applications, there's also a very real prospect of vexatious applications. And it seems to me if the mere lodgement of an online form, I mean, Minnie Mouse could do it, that might raise some eyebrows, but then sees the property end up in a publicly searchable register for a period of time, that seems to me like a great opportunity to snooker an auction or some marketing campaign by somebody who doesn't like the thought of something being demolished or sold, or even doesn't like their neighbour, So I think that's a concern, and I'm troubled when, even tonight, we've heard from submitters very keen that identity of nominators be protected at all costs. And I mean, transparency, in my view, is a two-way street. But so I think there's a flaw there in terms of not seeking their identity. I'm also interested to understand what do we mean by information? Because, you know, a nominator might believe certain things, but they're based on rumour, hearsay or innuendo and have no basis in fact. So, I mean, the devil here is in the detail, but what sort of information would we act on or consider appropriate to act on absent documents that prove what's being asserted?
Councillor Park, your question finished?
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Thank you for the question. So the type of information and documentary evidence that we're talking about, it's not just a matter of someone saying, oh, I think, you know, this architect designed that house. There would need to be either some plans or original specifications or something that would support that claim or provide the evidence to do so. Just simply writing it into a form and saying, I think this person lived there, or I think that person built this house, or they were associated with that, that's not going to be sufficient for us to accept a nomination. There has to be evidence to support that. And if we as officers are not satisfied or can't determine the veracity, the accuracy of that, then that's what the heritage consultants are there for us to fall back on and seek their advice as to whether they believe that this information is actually genuine or not.
So could there ever be, in your view, a situation where information is accepted absent any documentary evidence?
No, I don't believe so. The process spells out that there needs to be supporting and documentary evidence to support that information.
I just want to be clear that we're on the same page here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask that again, just to make sure. Could there ever be a situation where information that isn't supported by documentary evidence is acted upon?
I would say no.
Right. So then, on page 56, would it be fair to say that on page 56, the second dot point, that the words information and/or could be struck out to give unambiguous clarity to the intention?
Yes.
Can I borrow your pen? Thank you. My next question, sorry, Chair, but I suppose everybody's had a bit of a long-winded session. The next question is, what's the likely time frame from that box up in the top left corner? So we've added the property to the list, and from this moment on, it's searchable for the world at large. What would you anticipate would be the minimum time period before we could get to the yes/no boxes? Is there any new information? How long would it, at best scenario, how long would that be?
So can you repeat that question for my benefit now, Councillor Park?
So the diagram on page 55, in the middle, the second box, is there any new information about the place's significance? To get that yes or no, what's the best time scenario between that box and having added it to the property list of possible heritage places?
Is that an answerable question? Could you answer that question?
Sorry, I might just have to take a step back and go to the previous question that you asked, which I answered with yes, as to whether that first point where it says add property to list of on the top left there, that's not public, that's internal only.
Right, okay.
Sorry,
that's fine.
That's
okay.
that's only internal. The first point where it becomes public is that box underneath that, a little bit further down, where it says published list of nominations accepted through Council's interactive heritage map. So just that's clarification on that.
That's fine, and that probably renders my question then irrelevant, because I was obviously concerned about that being in the public domain.
Councillor Park, it seems like you have something else in mind? Because I'm seeing third and fourth go now, and I think it's sort of getting a bit long.
Well, not for me.
No, not yourself. No, I'm just looking at the forward agenda here. But no, I'm waiting for yourself. Thank you.
Could the process be easily altered to require the nominated to prove who they are upon lodging the documents?
Mr. Walker?
Through yourself, Chair, the current process is set up to ask for the nominator's contact details. It would be possible for that to be tightened in terms of the nominator making declarations or statutory declarations as to who they are or where they live or where they're from. So that would be possible and would be a possible change to the process to give some greater certainty as to the contact person's details.
I mean, or to simply upload some proof of identification. Is that something that could or would be implemented as part of this without an amendment, or would that require an amendment to the motion?
Again, through yourself, Chair, I don't believe that would need any change to this flow chart and what's being adopted this evening to make that type of change, to tighten up on the details and veracity the details of the nominator.
So I missed the first bit of that answer.
That wouldn't require any change to the flow chart to make that sort of change.
Thank you, Chair. My final question is, in respect of that adding of the property list, adding the property to the list of possible places that was described as internal and not open to the public, at what point does the property owner first become aware? Is it at that point or is it a subsequent point?
So at the point where we've received the nomination and we've checked that all the information is there and potentially verified the person exists, and at that point they will receive a letter to tell them that we've received the nomination, right, and on what grounds that nomination was received, and that's the first point that they'll find out about it.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Park. I think we have one final question, or Councillor Sinfield, is your... No questions. Well, thank you for that. Return back to Councillor Hollingsworth. You indicated would like to move a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to support the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Gillies, thank you. Is there any opposition to this motion? Councillor Watson and Councillor Park. Having opposition to this motion, Councillor Hollingsworth, would you like to speak to your motion?
Thank you, Mr Chair. Look, I would also like to acknowledge that with Councillor Gillies and Councillor Sinfield also serving on the Heritage Advisory Committee, that they may like to speak, so I'll keep my comments fairly brief. I first of all wanted to thank Mr Walker as the Director of Urban Planning, Mr Cohen as the Manager, and Mr Wilmson, and also not here this evening, Mr Costello, for the 12 months plus that they've invested working with council, councillors, community to prepare this document before us this evening. Now, this document is supported by a 44-page information guide that outlines with great detail the process of how the community heritage nomination would work. The flowchart in itself is a summary, but there is a lot of detail in the 44 pages that could answer several of the questions that have been asked this evening. I wanted to again reiterate that this document is all about transparency, and as the questions have been answered, when a nomination is put forward, if it is supported by a department, the property owner is the first to be notified. So the property owner will be well aware of a nomination put forward. The various pages in the 44-page document, page 6 goes to the nomination form for ease of access. As I asked before, if hyperlinks are put into the document for people to view this online, the hyperlinks will take people to all the information they require. On page 18 of the document refers to the Burundara Planning Scheme amendment process. We then go into Appendix 1 where it refers to the heritage studies that have been undertaken. This document provides information to all the HERCON criteria from Criterion A to Criterion H. It also provides a link to the Planning Practice Note and the Victorian Heritage Register criteria threshold guidelines. So it's a very, very informative document. I think the office has done an incredible job listening to the voices of many to produce this, and I wholeheartedly support it, and I would encourage councillors to also support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Councillor Gillies as the seconder. Would you like to speak now or withhold your right?
I'll withhold for the moment. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Does any other councillor wish to speak? Oh, Councillor Watson, of course.
Thank you. I'm opposed to this motion, Chair. That's been a position I've held all the way through the process of considering what's in front of us tonight. I think this is a big departure from the way that we have approached heritage in Burundara. And I'll use the example of Rosebery Street and what the first heritage consultant said. And they put forward the principle that there was a representative sample of that type of heritage property already protected. So this seems to be moving from this idea that unless something is individually significant, and that's beyond question. If you have a significant heritage property, of course you should protect it. But this notion of going beyond, well, we've got a sample of workers' cottages, we've got a sample of modernists, or whatever it is, to this notion that we will protect everything on an individual basis. So it's a big shift. The other thing I have great concerns about is that thinking about the people concerned here. So you do have a community that has demonstrated and said, we value heritage. And that message has come through very clear. But we also have people, and while we're not allowed to consider whether something does or doesn't affect property value, let's still be cognizant of the fact that when people buy a home, it's the biggest asset they'll ever have. And when anybody contemplates change to their dwelling, whether it's to demolish or to extend, it's a big deal. It requires a lot of thought and planning and investment in those plans. And I have grave concerns about introducing a process that there is no degree of certainty around, that they could essentially have their plans derailed for 12 to 18 months. And that's significant in the life cycle of a planning, of a family and their planning. It has potentials to derail auctions, as talked about by Councillor Park, and let's not ever forget that what we're introducing here is another layer of bureaucracy, and we're spending $790,000 of ratepayers' money on an ongoing process that we engage in from time to time, where we have the big lumpy expenditure of a heritage study. Those things will continue to go on, but now we have this continual process with, I think, the cultural change from, well, we're no longer happy with a representative sample, and we've gone from the exception. Everyone understands, oh dear, we could miss something. That's fine. To people who potentially will wander the streets and say...
I need you to wrap it up because you've gone over.
And say, oh, goodness, that's lovely. Oh, I heard so-and-so might be moving. Oh, we better check this out. I mean, it just has the potential to be weaponised, and I just cannot support what is proposed here tonight. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to support Councillor Hollingsworth's motion. The process before us may not be perfect. I have some reservations with it, but I think it's a major step forward. It does provide clarity of process for everyone involved. We're currently dealing with these on an ad hoc basis, officers, councillors, members of the public, and I think at least to set out a process that we can all read is a major step forward. Also on transparency, and look, this is a very challenging issue. As councillors, we've all dealt with it. Property owners have, expectations that they can do something. They may look at their property and be of the view that there's no heritage merit in their property and set up with a way to go forward. There has been this sort of process where some properties have been on lists for potential heritage nomination. This will actually take us a big step forward in terms of transparency. It may not be everything, but it does go, and this is an issue that's always concerned me. I know Mr. Price raised it, and it's often raised by those who are not supportive of heritage, but they've got a right to raise these issues, and they're real, and I actually think we are going much further down a path of transparency. It may not be perfect. There may still be limitations in terms of last-minute applications that come forward, etc. But certainly it's a major step forward. And I think the fact that it'll come back for review at different times gives us an opportunity to look at it again, all these issues. In relation to the budget, I mean, I have some reservations about the budget provisions that are outlined in this report, but we're not making a decision about the budget here. That decision will be made at a different forum in relation to our budget. So I think we should all be conscious of that this is sort of part one of getting this through. And I note that council officers and management will provide us, at least as councillors, with more information to assist us in that regard. So I welcome that. And finally, on the thematic studies, look, I think Councillor Watson makes a good point in that our thematic studies are arguably coming to a close, or area-based studies, and why don't we review? I mean, I, for example, have constantly put forward the idea of post-war or modernist area thematic study, and I think that's something that has merit. I think those approaches are better. but I don't think they preclude a process that we've got here. So I think we're still going to need a process to deal with such ad hoc requests. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of remarks to make about this, but first and foremost, I want to thank our community for their patience and their gift of feedback as we've gone through this process, particularly over the last 12 months. This process has been a very long time in the making and was brought to the Chamber in May 2022, and then I think it was about September 2022, and on both of those occasions didn't meet community expectation. And I think what's important to highlight here is that officers and the Heritage Advisory Committee have been agile and responsive to the community feedback, and we're now at a point where I think the expectations and the process and the values shared between us have aligned, and I think this process is worth absolutely endorsing and testing for the next 12 to 24 months. The explanatory notes that are attached to this, as highlighted by Councillor Park earlier, those are a living document. That is not being endorsed tonight. That 44-page document at the back, or thereabouts, whatever it was. That's designed to be a living document that will evolve, provide greater clarity as we get questions and points of clarification sought by the community and by officers that have got to tighten and tweak and change things as to interpretation over the next 12 to 24 months, so that in 2 years' time we're at a point where we can bring this back to the Chamber and either throw it in the bin or continue it or tweak it and take it forward from there. It provides great transparency, and the fair process improves our current predicament, because at the moment we have nothing, and that doesn't provide certainty, clarity or transparency for either the community or our officers who are trying to work through this process. The resources attached to this motion will enable the well overdue strategic planning work, like the new Heritage Action Plan, to come to fruition. Because with or without a process right now, the community nominations don't stop. But what will become much more efficient with the adoption of this tonight is the process adopted by officers, so that they can work through that in a much more streamlined and focused way, so that they can be freed up to look at the strategic planning work that needs to be done. So not only is this a better process, to Councillor Addis's point, we currently don't have a process. So that clarity, I think, is exceptionally important. I'm really keen to see how this evolves, and I want it to succeed, not just quantified by the number of properties protected over the next year or two, but in the efficiencies gained within the department as well. And I seek the feedback from the Director, Scott Walker, over the coming 12 to 24 months as to what those efficiencies have been. I'd also very much like to thank the Heritage Advisory Committee members who have worked solely on this for the last 12 months at least, or probably 24 months, to be honest, because it has been distracting, but we've wanted to get this to a point where the community and the council align on things. And very much thanks to the officers for rethinking this, because we did put the previous iterations in the bin and go back to a blank piece of paper and start all over again. So thank you for working with us on that.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'm not sure I can yet support this, and I feel I need to give an explanation why. And it's for two main reasons, but perhaps I should first say that I certainly think that it does a very good job of protecting heritage, and that is something that's very important and very important to me. But it's also very important that we protect everyone, not just those who want to protect more heritage. And the two main reasons I struggle with it are that in many ways it's being described as an experiment that will be refined, and it seems to me that it's a very expensive experiment that I'd rather not launch into until I do feel comfortable with it. And the major reason why I'm not comfortable is that it doesn't protect those people who, in very good faith and with a great deal of money and effort, apply for a permit, either for demolition or renovation, and then the goalposts change for them. And nor does it protect those people who, in good faith, put their house on the market. And we've had many examples of that where it has been a horrible process for people that sometimes has ended supporting the property owner, not the nominator, but it's very expensive and very arduous. And I just don't think we've got to the point where owners are protected as much as the heritage is protected. So I'll perhaps wait to see what others say. I would like to support it, but I'm not sure I can.
Thank you, Councillor Adders. And Councillor Thompson, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I'm in two minds about this one. I will say on the outset, I will support it, but I'm not comfortable with it because it actually sends a signal that all of the work that we've done, the strategic work over the last 6 years, has been, I guess, frowned upon from the community's perspective, and that we haven't actually done a good enough job. And I think we've done an exceptional job in protecting heritage. I think the yield that we'll get from this exercise is going to be not a great amount of properties that we'll protect compared to what we've actually done from a strategic perspective from our gap studies. But in the absence of a formal process, my fear is what we've seen over the last 2 years will just continue. The residents and the community will still nominate and will still go through the merry-go-round of assessing various reports. So I think we do need something to formalise it. And when it comes to the $790,000, I actually think that money's better spent doing other strategic work. And I'd raised that previously, and I'd like for that to be considered in future budget discussions, because I think that's a really important part that we're actually not dealing with across the municipality from strategic planning perspectives. And we've got many, many more complicated planning issues to consider as a municipality than protecting a dozen homes over the next 2 years. That's my view, but as I say, I'll support this tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with all that Councillor Thompson just said, but I'll be doing the opposite of what he's doing. I'll be voting against it. I mean, I won't repeat what he said nor what Councillor Addis said, but I think in combination they really sum up my position. But I mean, it's $790,000 that we don't need to waste. There's plenty of demand, and there's never enough money to meet those demands. And we've, as a council over the last decade, spent millions and millions and millions of dollars on heritage protection. And I think there's got to come a time when we say, well, mission accomplished. Because if we don't get to that point, then this spending will just keep going. And my big fear is that the true costs, will be vastly more than $790,000. And this is work that's done at the expense of other work.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Before I move to the seconder and round out the debate by the mover, I might say a couple of words myself. The words of Councillor Park, Councillor Thompson and Councillor Adders resonate, but so has the debate. It's been an extraordinary debate, not only the transparency sought by the officers, but the way that the councillors debated this tonight made sure that we tested a lot of the areas to show our community how much both heritage means to us, but also how much individual rights for property owners mean. I'm going to support it though, because I take the view from the way that Councillor Sinfield posed that, we've done all this great work, but there are aspects in a municipality like ours, there are houses that we don't see them, we don't find them. They're hard to find, and the community brings them forward. We can go as we're going with the current process, and let's not forget, the current process is a process, but it's not transparent, and it has its own hidden costs. Just because those costs are not explicit, it doesn't make them any less real, both in opportunity cost or in aspects of funding on an ad hoc basis. So I don't think we can get away by the fact that our municipality asks us to protect the heritage, and now what we've got there for them is a transparent process where, when it is protected, they can feel almost 100% sure that real evidence has been provided as that quantum to help move it forward. That's the thing that tips me over to the support side. So that's sort of my few words on that. And I'll move back to the seconder and let her have her words.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it has been quite a journey, so I'd like to add my thanks to the officers and the community in working to reach this point. I would also like to acknowledge the concerns that have been expressed. This is a conversation that has been going on for a long time, so these are exactly the sorts of issues that have been, they've gone round and round. However, I would like to endorse the supportive comments that have already been made, and at the end of the day, the nominations will continue, and I believe it is strategically prudent to have a better, more transparent process in place than the current ad hoc approach. I don't think we can separate out the money issue and identify that as being just about heritage, because I think it's more deeply related to supporting the strategic planning department and what we want them to be doing and need them to be doing, heritage protection and more. And by having a better process in place, I think we go a long way towards assisting them to achieve that sort of goal. At the end of the day, Council and the community share a desire to see fair and transparent processes in place. And we do have to balance many aspects of appropriate development, our custodial responsibilities to city heritage, and individuals' intentions to use properties in the ways that they would like to use them. But that is a juggling act. I believe this process will actually help achieve that balance, and I commend it to my colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Gillis, I'll come back to you, Councillor Honsworth, to round out the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, my points predominantly want to reflect on the resources that we're proposing to invest in this, that they will be not exclusive to heritage nomination process. Resources will support other planning initiatives as well, but obviously we do need to recruit extra people in the planning department to mitigate this process in an efficient and effective way. And with what's proposed in this document will actually save officer time. It will help better spend budget, and I believe that it will provide greater support to not just the people that put forward nominations, but obviously the people that own properties that may not be aware of potential heritage development in their property. So it will help identify something that may or may not have been lost in previous gap studies. And there'd be many people that may be grateful to find out the value of their house if there is some heritage merit to it. So I would again like to thank everyone, and as councillors have mentioned here this evening, we thank the community for investing considerable time in bringing some of these issues to us that we hadn't considered in the years past, and to help put forward a process that the officers feel comfortable supporting. I think several of us here in the chamber are comfortable supporting, and as Councillor Sinfield has said, this will be tested in 12 months, it will be tested in 2 years. We have opportunity to adapt if we need to. This is the starting point, but it is a process. Thank you all.
Thank you, Councillor Honsworth. And now I put the motion. Those in favour? Those against? The motion is carried. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, officers. We'll move now to the item 4, general business. Councillors, are there any general business tonight? Any urgent business? There be no confidential business. Let me, before I close the meeting, to thank you all who have joined us this evening and wish you all and your family good health. I declare the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting closed.